Well, good morning, folks.
Good morning.
I hope you all enjoyed our keynote this morning.
Yes.
We're going to follow that the rest of the day with a series of really, I think there's some really interesting breakout sessions and specialty talks going on. So you should be, if you are in the right place, preparing to listen to a presentation on companion planting with native plants. It's my pleasure this morning to introduce Dr. Barbara Ryan. Barbara is a graduate of Georgetown University. She's the CBNL owner and founder, has a master's degree in sustainable landscape design from George Washington University, is a certified Virginia horticulturist, a certified level 2 Chesapeake Bay landscape professional. She holds BA, MA, and PhD degrees in economics from a former part of her life. In addition to her work designing native gardens, Barbara is actively involved in community environmental and conservation initiatives. She's been appointed to serve on the Fairfax County Drainsville District Tree Commissioner and on the county's Chesapeake Bay Preservation Ordinance Exception Review Committee. There's a lot of language on here. So, as well as the Citizens Advisory Group of Resilient Fairfax. In her spare time, she volunteers as a Fairfax Master Naturalist. She serves on the boards of the Virginia Native Plant Society, where she's the conservation chair, and the McLean Trees Foundation. She formerly chaired the McLean Citizens Association on Environment, Parks, and Recreation Committee. So a couple of programming notes. As we said this morning, this is an owl. It will pick up any, like if you drop a pin in this room, it's going to show up in our recording. So if you don't want the rest of the world to hear it later on, please keep it, please be quiet. It will also, during a Q&A period, it will track motion. And if you are both speaking and waving your hand, it will track into you and it will put you in one of the frames on the screen. So during the Q&A period, the owl will know who you are, where you are, and it will be listening. Right? So without further ado, Barbara, thank you for your time this morning.
Thanks so much for that great introduction. So I'm really thrilled to be here to talk about this topic. I want to thank Nancy Beers for inviting me to speak on this topic. It was a lot of fun to put together. I'll be talking about companion planting with native plants. And that would be with the purpose of creating beautiful naturalistic gardens. A little bit more about me, just to begin, and a little bit about you too. So I have been practicing sustainable landscape design I've been designing native gardens for almost 10 years. The last 5 with my company, Cambridge Native Landscapes. I operate primarily in northern Fairfax County, closer to where my location is. How did I get into this? A lifelong gardener as a hobbyist. While I was a professional PhD economist throughout my career. But about 15 years ago, I became a master naturalist. And that's when I learned about native plants for the first time ever. I had been exploring the natural areas that surround my property for many, many years without any understanding what's invasive, what's native, how can I recognize it? And it opened this whole huge world for me and insatiable curiosity, which led me to get my master's degree in sustainable landscape design at GW, a wonderful program, which unfortunately no longer exists, where we spent so much time in the field, documenting native plant communities and learning the mechanics of how to design a garden with native plants. So that is what I do now. I've kind of flipped it. Now my livelihood and, how I spend most of my time has to do with nature, horticulture, design, gardening, and economics is a hobby. So, and I'm much happier as a result. I also love to just go around natural areas and take pictures. Photography is another hobby of mine. I have an Instagram account where I document kind of what hits me. And I also have a blog. I keep a nature journal. And I also write a lot about the use of native plants edible, medicinally, which I do also kind of on the side. And then my 2 sidekicks are Jack and Max, 2 yellow Labradors. They often have appearances on my Instagram account, and they love native plants too. So question about all of you here. How many of you are new to native plants? How many of you are kind of experienced, but just like to learn more about it? The ins and outs. Great. Okay. Well, thanks again for being here. I like to start off whenever we talk about anything related to this topic of what is a native plant, how I Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. What is your blog? How do I get to your?
Oh, it's on my website. It's on my website,
And how do I get to your website?
www.chainbridgenativelandscapes.com.
Okay.
I should have put a QR code on here, I'm sorry. Anyway. Similar to what you've heard already today from Doug Tamley, if you were here for his movie. I define what's native in terms of, you know, these are plants and animals that have evolved in a given area along with all of the kind of wildlife and the other organisms that are growing in this ecological community. As opposed to, in the past, I think some people tended to define it in terms of, well, it was plants that were here before the Europeans arrived, et cetera, et cetera. It's much more about that synergistic connection with the whole ecosystem. And so that's kind of how I look at what is a native plant. The question, why plant native plants? Why do we even need to ask that question? If you're here, you already know why to plant native plants, and we could easily spend the whole hour talking about this and all the benefits related to wildlife and the ecosystem and climate change resilience and stormwater management and everything else. But you just look at this picture, to me, this is kind of it. This is a wet meadow. These are Bidens growing naturally. They're a wonderful native that tends to appear in more natural areas as opposed to cultivated. And it's just, you know, the moment that I took this picture, it was just so alive with all sorts of pollinators and butterflies and everything else. And to me, that's one of the main reasons to do this personally. You know, there's so many social and reasons to do it, environmental reasons, but there's a personal connection. So when I was asked to talk about native companion plants, I was like, okay, so the first thing that came to my mind was the use of companion plants in vegetable gardening. And funny, you already heard about this from Keith, from our previous speaker, that, you know, obviously, if you're a vegetable gardener, you know about planting plants together to basically create this, you know, to achieve certain purposes. And this is the classic three sisters, where you have corn, which is providing the structure, and you've got beans that are providing nitrogen to the soil, and then you've got squash, which is shading the soil. And so that's the three sisters often planted together, and those are vegetable companion plants. But none of these plants, as I think Keith mentioned, are native. And so this is not what we're talking about when we're talking about companion planting with native plants. This is a different thought, a different application of the same idea. The second thing that comes to my mind when I think about companion planting has to do with ecological companion plants. And these are plants that are kind of identified together in natural plant communities. And those natural plant communities can exist in stream valleys or prairies or woodland or any kind of an environment. The unique thing about natural plant communities is that there are environmental conditions which lead to groupings, almost like social groupings of plants that just exist in those natural plant communities. And often when you go into natural areas and you see certain plants growing naturally in the wild, and then you start to see others growing there, you're like, ah, that's a natural plant community, and then you can identify it. And this, for me as a designer, is an essential first step of any kind of thought given to a property that you're, you know, trying to think about converting it to native. You want to try to understand, what would the natural plant community be? What was it before development? You look for reference areas nearby, maybe natural areas that were never developed, have similar conditions, and then you think, well, that's the natural plant community. And then you can go and kind of think about, well, what plants exist in that natural plant community? And our wonderful Department of Conservation and Recreation, DCR in Virginia, has compiled this incredible document, which is on their website, which documents the plants that exist in over 300 natural plant communities that they have identified in the state of Virginia. So it's a great reference tool. But that's not what we're talking about here today either. Because while I say this is an essential first step, this is more sort of about site design and plant selection. And I'm going to assume throughout this whole talk that you've already you've at least done part of this. You've figured out what your site conditions are, you figured out what types of plants, they're either shade loving, sun loving, they need wet, they need dry, and you've done this, so we're not gonna be talking about this. What we
Excuse
are
you?
gonna-
Excuse me, the people who are remote cannot see the slides. Can tech please fix that?
Apologies, I'm working on that now. I'm
Okay,
seeing- and this is for the companion plant talk, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, the slides
Okay.
are not advancing.
Oh,
Oh,
that's fine,
how strange.
yeah, should I keep going while you work on
Yeah,
that?
try- go
or
ahead.
no? Okay.
Try it.
Okay, this is what we are gonna be talking about today, aesthetic companion plants. How do you combine native plants aesthetically? It's a very familiar topic if you are a traditional gardener, if you've been gardening for many, many years. Think about what plants go together, what plants should I select? And so it's a different element than what we were just talking about. So we're gonna talk about this from an aesthetic point of view. And it has more to do with, once you understand your site, what plants do you put in that site? And how do you combine them? And this is a picture, for those of you, particularly if you can't see the slide, we've got a picture of a aster bloom and with goldenrod about to bloom behind it. And a bumblebee is working furiously at the center of this aster. And these are perfect companions. These are perfect native companion plants, as you'll see when we go through this discussion. They are perfect because they occur at the same time. They are complementary in terms of color. But even from a broader standpoint, they are truly perfect because they are exactly what the bees and pollinators want at the time that they are blooming. The bees, if you've ever observed a patch of aster and goldenrod growing together, often they occur together naturally. Sometimes people plant them together. They drive the bees wild in the fall.
Keep going, I'm sorry. for the
Okay.
interruption.
This was the next plant. This was the next slide. You advanced it. Okay.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. Let me just make sure we're in the right place here. Oh, this isn't working.
Okay, that's not good.
Okay.
I'm gonna go back one.
Yeah, and then just make sure we didn't skip one. I don't think we did. No, this is the right one. Okay, we can go forward with this. Okay. So, what you're looking at.
Oh, boy, now we start
That's
over again.
okay.
I'm so sorry.
No, you're working hard over there. You're multitasking. Okay, great. All right, and I'll see if this works at the next one. Traditional flower bed. You are a traditional gardener. You've been gardening for many years, as I have. This is what it really focuses on, the intent. This is very typical. This is a bed of impatiens here in front of a building with evergreen non-native shrubs. And, you know, whoever designed this had a choice. When they went into the nursery, they had a choice. They had colors. And somebody made the decision, I want pinks and reds, and whites and purples. And I'm gonna plant these in rows, and this is the way it's gonna look through the whole growing season until fall comes along. And it's gonna look the same every day. And it's not, and it's the way I want it to be, because it's my idea of where the color should be. And what the color should be. And I can guarantee you that there are few if no bees and pollinators visiting this garden at all. It looks kind of organized and neat. Let's see if this works. That does not work now. Maybe I need to turn it off and on again.
Or you can just holler at me and I'll.
Yeah, go,
I'll do
if you
that.
could advance, that'd be great. I'll just forget
I
about
think
that.
I can do that.
Okay, so how do we color with native plants? It's just so different from the traditional look. It's completely different. For one thing, the colors of native plants are often muted, as shown here. They're muted for a couple of reasons. A lot of them just are muted in their form, in their natural form, and even when they're peak. Others are past their peak and they're still there, and they're just getting a little bit muted. And that's fine. We don't cut them down when they get a little muted. We enjoy that evolution of the color. And the other thing that's unique about native plants is that spring and fall are predominated by yellows and blues. There are a few exceptions to that. They stand out, and that's kind of the way I use them. But spring and fall, as you will see, because we will go through the year, are dominated by the blues and the yellows, and there is a reason for that, and it's because those are the colors that bees and pollinators really go wild over, and that's what they can see. And so it's kind of our natural system is driving this, not us. We're not going into a nursery and saying, well, I want yellow and blue and orange and purple. It's our ecology that's driving what colors are open to us. And it's also in the season. Is it spring? Is it summer? Is it fall? Go ahead and move to the next one. So let's talk about color. This is a typical color wheel. You're all familiar with this, probably from grade school. Next one. And so over there on the left, next slide, please. You have your cool colors. Next slide, please. And your cool colors are primarily the blues and the greens up to the violets. And those cool colors, the blues in particular, they retreat. They step back in the landscape. And they're kind of, sometimes they just form an effective background color, or they're just not as, they catch your eye, but in a very subtle way. Next slide, please. Next two slides. On the other side are the warm colors, the reds, the yellows, and the oranges. And those are more predominant. They come out into the front, they pop in the front. And so on that side, you're seeing some fall colors and some of the really bright colors that our native plants display in the fall. Next slide, please. So when we think about what do we want to combine in a garden, one of the kind of most common ways to combine plants is to use complementary colors. And that's straight across the color wheel. Complementary colors. And I've kind of put that horizontal bar between the blue and the yellow, because that is the color combination, the colors that are available mostly in native planting, and they're there in the spring, they're there in the fall, because of the way native plants are. And so that's kind of one of the most common things that you can do, and that horizontal line can go anywhere. You're just going to the opposite sides of those of the color wheel. Next slide, please. So you can also combine the colors that are adjacent on the color wheel, and that would be sort of similar to what you're seeing on the upper right picture there. And these are going to be really vibrant. You're combining the reds and the oranges and the and even maybe the bright yellows all together. And as much as you might want to try to do this intentionally, often it just evolves. It's like you can do this in the fall much more easily than you can do this in the spring. So again, it's dictated by what's available. Next slide, please. And then you can also combine sort of this triangle, and you can take intervals, red with blue with yellow. Sort of the bottom line point here is you can do whatever you want. There is no rule about color and which colors there might have been back in the old day when we weren't talking about native plants, but you can basically combine any colors you want. Next slide, please. And it's also really important to think, once again, it's not what we want when we go into the nursery and pick out those colors. It's what our objective is. If we're trying to attract pollinators, if we're trying to attract bees, we have to think about what they are seeing. They don't see colors that humans see. They see more colors than what we see. So on this chart, I was like, the human slides should actually, we go from red to ultraviolet. We cannot see the far left infrared. neither can bees, and bees can't see red either. And they can't even see orange, okay? Bees are basically, their range of color is from yellow to violet, which we can see, and then beyond that, ultraviolet, which we cannot see. So when you're thinking about attracting bees and pollinators, these are the colors you want to be focusing on. If you want to use red, that's wonderful. You'll attract hummingbirds. But chances are you're not going to attract bees with those red flowers. And so you want to think about this, and you don't have to think about it too much, because honestly, nature does it for you. That's why in the spring and the fall, yellows and blues are predominant among our native plants in terms of their blooms. And that's because that's what bees see. Okay, next slide. The other thing in addition, so that we just have talked about color as an important aspect for combining plants. And now I'm going to switch just for a second to structure, because we have that dimension, which you also have in non-traditional, but with native plants, you've got actually so much more. You've got grasses, and grasses provide not only that backbone structure, but they provide a lot of textural interest. So we have on the left here, we've got switchgrass and some, it's mixed in there, although you can't see it's a little blue stem. And then structure moving to the right, taller perennials, shorter perennials. So differences in that, as well as differences in leaf. Some plants, basal leaves on the ground, and some of them have leaves growing up. And so there are different types of leaf structures. And then we have more grasses. That's a little blue stem. And white and yellow blue flag iris on the right. So we want to take into account structure as well as color as we think about this. Next slide. One of my favorite, I always put native plant, I always put grasses into a design landscape, assuming that's what the client wants, but I always try to do that because it's so wonderful, and in the winter it looks great. And so another thing I've learned about switchgrass is that in the winter, well, at least my yellow lab likes to hide in it. He doesn't think I can see him, but they just love hanging out in it. And so there he is, and like, I spy you. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so another sort of general thought about designing and the kind of elements of design. Color, structure, and also just kind of like thinking about finding inspiration in nature. So I said I've spent untold amount, hours and hours exploring natural areas, looking at what happens in nature. And the whole idea of a sustainable landscape, of course, is to emulate that nature in a cultivated landscape. You want to try to replicate that. And that's, my preference is always towards naturalistic landscape design, as opposed to trying to create some kind of formality. Unless the client really wants a formal look, which is appropriate for certain situations, front yard, HOAs, et cetera, you need that. But when I look at nature, what do I see? First, I see everything growing in layers. You see layers in the trees, you see layers among the plants that are growing. They're not just all uniform length, uniform height, they're growing in layers. Canopy trees, shrubs, herbaceous, ground cover. And then the colors, again, quite muted in nature. You'll occasionally see pops of color, like the yellow in the lower left. You'll see the pokeweed berries there, but it's primarily this kind of calming color palette with a lot of neutral tones and greens. A lot of different textures we're going to see throughout. Plants growing together, and a touch of whimsy. If you walk around, you'll see, the fiddleheads coming up, and just kind of looking magical. So trying to incorporate this in how we combine plants. Next slide, please. Okay, so what we've done just now is what I consider the introduction of what we're talking about. When I think about combining plants, native plants, I think about two essential dimensions to apply to every application. The first is what I just mentioned, planting in layers, which we call matrix planting. And the second is successional planting, which is planting for all seasons. So let's say you have a garden and you're trying to make it a naturalistic native garden from scratch. These are these two dimensions you're going to be working with. One is the horizontal layered gardening, and the other one is the intertemporal succession planting over time within that garden. Next slide, please. So this is matrix planting, a nice diagram from a book written by Thomas Rainier and Claudia West called Planting in a Post-Wild World. I highly recommend the book. I was actually really fortunate to take a design course under Thomas Rainier right after he published this book, and it was fascinating. I love this dark diagram because it's just kind of a broken apart 3D representation of what a matrix plant design is and how to plant in layers. The top layer are is your structural layer. These are plants that they generally will persist through the year. Trees, shrubs, woodies, and then some taller perennials and grasses that also persist through the year, providing you don't cut them down. And they provide backbone to the garden throughout the winter. And then the next layer below are your seasonal theme layer. It's your seasonal theme layer. These are pockets of and small groupings of perennials that flower at certain times of the year. And not all the same time, but different times. And that gives you that successional planting ability. And then on the bottom layer is the one that in some sense creates the most function to the garden, and that is your ground layer. And your ground layer is going to be basically your very densely planted ones that hug the ground. And they prevent erosion, they prevent weeds, so they are very functional, but it has to be planted densely. Next slide, please.
Question on, or did you want to make questions?
Your call.
Sure, go ahead. I want to make sure we're going to stick on time though.
Okay, so the structural layer, I see, obviously in that sample, you've got like something like Joe Pine and a tree. And so there's a big variation in height. So what are the qualities that you're looking for in structural plants? It obviously isn't just height, is it just that they stay complete all through?
It's partly height and
Okay.
it's longevity. They stay throughout the winter.
Okay.
So let's go to this, because I think your question will be answered more as we go through this. So, okay, this is kind of a different depiction of what we mean by matrix planting. Next slide, please. So you have this plot. Let's say you have a square plot. You want to have a garden. You're going to plant your ground cover. This is actually supposed to be light green. It looks a little white here. You're going to fill that minus whatever else you put in there, but you're going to basically fill that with your ground cover plants. Now, when I do gardens and I plant in layers and do matrix gardening, I usually plant my ground covers with what we call landscape plugs. And those are usually sold, they're native plants, ground covers sold in flats. And flats of 50, usually about 32 to 50. And they're small, but they're very deep rooted. And so you can plant them closely. I generally plant ground covers on 12-inch centers, which means I'm planting them about 12 inches apart. So you have a plant in every foot of your garden to cover the ground. Next slide, please. So now the next layer that you think about is your structural layer. And those, again, that can be your trees, it can be shrubs, woodies, but here just shrubs. And you might put them around the edge. You might put them in the center, depending on what you're trying to accomplish. If you put a tree in the center, you're going to have a shady garden someday. So, you may not want to do that. Next slide, please. Then you can also have as your structural layer, it can be grasses, or it could be very tall perennials like the Joe Pye. And you might want to sprinkle those out because they're going to provide that backbone also for your perennials. They give the perennials something to lean on if they get a little floppy. Next slide. And then you have your seasonal theme perennials, which you're going to plant in groupings, maybe 3 to 5, but just groupings, so you don't have one by itself. And you're planting those with an eye to, well, I want to make sure things are blooming kind of all the time. So I'm gonna put the spring here and here, and I'm gonna put the fall here and here in the summer. So you mix them around, okay, so that's just a schematic. When I do designs, I go through this process similarly. First, I put together a list of the plants that I think will go in that design. And I sort them by whether they're structural, seasonal, or ground. And then I look at when they're gonna bloom. And I kind of have all that laid out on a spreadsheet. And then I populate my AutoCAD design with those. And you can see in the AutoCAD design, I have put a plant in every single square foot of this design. This used to all be lawn. And so, and you have the trees, and you have the shrubs, and then you have the ground layer. Next slide. So, I'm gonna talk about a few of my favorite ground cover, seasonal, and structural. So I want to say a caveat, first of all, which are, these are my favorites, tried and true. Some of them are good for shade, some of them are good for sun, so they're not sorted that way. Again, I'm assuming that you kind of know what you're looking for, and you've done the research on the plant. I also, you may find a few plants in here that are not technically, they're native, but they're not in the Virginia flora. And that is because, that's based on my experience. Quite honestly, I have found that some plants, particularly sedges, that are technically native to slightly southern areas, maybe Tennessee or North Carolina, do better here than some that are in the flora. And maybe that's climate change beginning to work. I'm not sure what it is, but you'll also find, I also do grow certain perennials for medicinal purposes that may not be native. One of them is echinacea, purpurea, not native to Virginia, but I grow it because I use it medicinally to make teas and tinctures. And so anyhow, these are my favorite ground covers, all sorts of characters. Which characters is subject for another day. There's too many. But I have I've had a lot of experience with sedges that work and sedges that don't work. Moss phlox, everybody knows moss phlox. I love moss phlox. First thing to bloom. My preference is always for blue moss phlox, not the pinks, not the really bright purples and everything else, because those are the ones that attract bees. It's the blues. And I know you can get bright pink phlox, but it's not my first choice. Christmas fern, you can use ferns as a ground cover. Foam flower is another great one. On the bottom, a heath aster, fall blooming, does great in sun. And so, you know, that's a really good one. Packer aurea is a workhorse. It's an absolute workhorse for stormwater or anywhere you need to really fill an area. Pretty robust though. And then wild geranium and Canadian anemone canadensis, which I love, also very robust. And when I say robust, it's just like, watch out. So let's move to the next slide.
Is the carrots, is that not invasive, but will it spread?
Most carrots are conforming, so they.
So if you plant them, they're not going to compete with whatever you're planting for.
It depends on the carrots, but generally not. They're generally pretty companionable. Yes,
Okay.
yes. So seasonal themes, my favorites: butterfly weed, orange coneflower, or black-eyed Susan, whichever you want to call it, columbine, the wild bergamot, which is the purple version of the bee balm, and New York aster and goldenrod in the fall, and also in the fall whitewood aster, and then turtlehead is more of a summer one. So these are just some of my favorites, and these will be examples of plants that you could just put in those pockets in your garden for that seasonal color. Next. And then structural, you know, as I mentioned, they can be shrubs, they can be trees. I don't have trees here, but I roll with my favorite shrubs, native shrubs, and then grasses and tall perennials. So among the shrubs, inkberry is always great. Here it is playing that role of allowing other the herbaceous perennials to lean on it. Virginia sweetspire, great plant, great shrub, easy to grow. Smooth ritherodon is another one of my favorites. It's more formal, it's native, but it is more formal. It does really well in front yard situations. And then so does the summer sweet plethora alnifolia. This is ruby spice pictured here. But the white ones do as well too. And then on the bottom, the grasses, I mentioned switchgrass and little blue stem, love those two. And swamp milkweed would be a perennial that kind of is more structural. It grows taller and it does have some longevity to its form, as well as gayflower, called perennials. Next slide. So key to thinking about planting matrix type layouts or for native plants is planting densely. So you can see how densely, and then we have all of these grasses going in there in pots, but in between the grasses are more of, this is Pachyra aurea in here, because this was an area next to a parking lot that got flooded and we were trying to absorb that stormwater. And then on the lower right, that's what it looked like after a year. So here are just some examples of matrix planting in work, in operation. So here we just got you're not really, the structural, you're seeing grasses, that's switchgrass. There's others in there as well. You're seeing some taller perennials, but mainly you're seeing the seasonal perennials in here, as well as the ground cover down at the bottom. In the center, you can see the heath aster at work there, and there is also Pachyra aurea, golden ground cell in here on the ground layer as well. So all kind of melding together into a very naturalistic look. Next slide. The close up, here we have the Pachyra aurea golden ground cell kind of nestled in there among a sedge. This is one of the larger sedges that has big inflorescences in the spring. And then and so you've got those layers there, and there's more layers in the back, but you just kind of see how they're just like really nicely nestling together and blending. Next slide. So this is more of a kind of muted matrix planting. A lot of green here, again, you know, totally native. So we have sedge growing there. There's we had about 15 or so blue star Amsonia tabernae, fabulous native plant. And so nestled in among the sedges, and then we have little blue stem. So they all kind of meld together, and then, you know, in the fall on the right, the little blue stem really begins to take over and show itself. And right around that time is when the blue star Amsonia begins to turn color. So that's just an example of just other kind of things that you can put together. You don't have to have a lot of plants to do a matrix planting. You can have like here, 3, and it works. Good. Next slide. This is an example of what used to be turf that we converted into a matrix garden. We have a tree, that's a white fringe tree there. And then we included in here a variety of low shrubs. It's actually Aronia melanocarpa. And then we have Euchre aurea growing, that's a perennial. And what's done blooming here, Coreopsis was covered with yellow earlier, and that's gone. We have the asters growing in the back, so this was kind of a late summer. And then there's sedges sort of filling in between everywhere as the ground cover matrix layer. Next slide. This is another designed garden where we have the layer, we had used blue-eye grass here as the ground cover. And then we had, it's done blooming, but Coreopsis, yellow threadleaf tick seed, mixed with Virginia sweet spire, which is now turning color here, and a few other shrubs that are taller. We have some plethora in there. They just create that layered look and seasonal interest. Next slide. And this was us like a matrix planting in the making, where existing tree, but we wanted there to be more layer amongst the rocks in this little kind of rock garden. So we have a variety of shrubs. These happen to be summer sweet, Plethora alnifolia. And then we were planting Euchre aurea also in there, as well as probably some foam flower. And we have a few, I think we were still in the process at this point of laying out the ground layer landscape clumps, but you can see a few of them lying on the ground. And so that's in process and a layered landscape. Next slide. So just a word I said a minute ago, you don't need to have a whole lot of plants to do a matrix landscape. Sometimes keeping it simple is the best way to go. And a lot of it is dictated not just by preferences, but by the plants. So Pachyra aurea is robust. It tends to it's a, you know, sometimes it doesn't want to share its space. And sometimes it's best to just let it go. And so on the right, that is primarily a large planting of Packer aurea under a maple tree. That's one edge of it. There are other things in there. You're not seeing it right now because right now all you're seeing are those incredible yellow blooms of spring. And on the left, mountain mint. So mountain mint is another one that is pretty robust. The objective of is always biodiversity, but sometimes the plant's characteristics need to be taken into consideration as well. And mountain mint is one of those that likes to create these big swaths. And it does so beautifully. So here we've got the other layers kind of tucked in. You can't really see them here. They're here and there, but they're also primarily along the edges. Next slide. We're switching now to the second principle of planting, companion planting with native plants, and that is succession gardening. The whole idea of succession gardening is having something happening throughout the year, not just static. So this is actually the front curb of my house. And in the early spring, not much going on there, a few leftover daffodils from old days of yore. And you can begin to see the beginnings of the perennial plants coming up. And then in spring, there's a lot of green. If you look closely, you can see moss, you can see the creeping moss phlox, and you can see some Packer aurea in there also blooming, but mostly greens and blues. And then in early summer, the echinacea, which is another one that can really take over if you let it. But you see other perennials, so a lot happening in early summer. In late summer and early fall, the echinacea is fading. And the mountain mint has come into play, and we've got in the back, we've got the black-eyed Susan, and you can't really see it, but there is the Joe Pye weeds further back, and a lot of sedges, and Packer aurea has now turned into a nice evergreen ground cover. And then, of course, in winter, if you leave it standing and have a snowfall, you have this incredible display. So that's the objective of successional planting, something happening all the time. Next slide, please. So we're going to go on a little tour of what plants bloom when. And you're going to see what I was talking about the yellows and blues in the spring and the yellows and blues in the fall, with some exceptions. But in the early spring, the first thing to pop up are the ephemerals. And in some sense, these are their own companions. If you are lucky enough to have a site where this comes up, this is primarily a woodland. These are woodland plants. And again, you're seeing mostly blues, you're seeing mostly yellows and greens and a little purple here. You've got the bloodroot, you've got the toadshade, you've got the mayapple, yellow trout lily, and Virginia bluebell. And there's nothing else going on at the time. So this is your companion planting for this time of year. There's really nothing else you can do now. The trees haven't even leafed out yet, which is why they're popping up. They get that sun. Once the trees leaf out, they disappear. So move on. And then we move into those native plants, usually in more cultivated areas I'm going to show here, that actually do kind of come into play. So again, we have the moss phlox. I'm showing here the blue, which is kind of my favorite. The Packer aurea, and then of course the lawn lovers dilemma, which is violet, which I happen to love. And you can really reduce your anxiety if you learn to love violet and stop trying to fight it. Just give into it. So that's early spring. Next slide. And then further into the spring, we've got the Geranium maculatum, the Amsonia tabernaemontana, and the blue-eyed grass. So again, we've got more blues and little purples, and that's for the bees. Next slide. We have crested iris, favorite, comes into play, wonderful ground cover too. Columbine, which is one unusual red in the spring. And then Zizia aurea golden Alexander is a fabulous spring perennial that is a little bit taller, but again, just, really glorious and fabulous. So next.
Good, about 15 minutes for you.
Yeah, thank you. So here are just some combinations of flowers in the spring. I love combining wild geranium and zinnia aurea. Next slide. And I love combining Packer aurea golden groundsel with various sedges. They just look really great. The sedges are usually flowering with their inflorescences at the same time that the Packer is blooming in yellow. Next slide. And the Amsonia of Cabernet Montana and various sedges. Again, it just blends so beautifully, looks so fresh in the spring, the greens, the yellows, and the blues. Next slide. Again, moss phlox and sedges. Next. And then blue-eyed grass is a great one. And back there you have some of the pink moss phlox, which kind of really pops out, as you can see. Next. Oh, and then here is, so ostrich fern is another one that's great in the spring, also very robust. Here we have it with woodland phlox, which in this case is white. It can also, if there is a cultivar that's blue, and some of the columbine. So this just makes a really wonderful, fresh spring combination. Eventually, the moss phlox the woodland phlox kind of mutes out, and the ostrich fern stays pretty vibrant unless it gets too hot in late summer, and then it might get a little brown and crispy. Next. Now we're into summer. We get more brighter colors in the summer. Now we are getting more, and then it's more about attracting butterflies too, because now the butterflies are on the scene. You're not seeing many butterflies in May and April, but you're seeing the butterflies, you're beginning to. And so we've got the butterfly weed with its orange, and we've got the Coreopsis verticillata with its yellow, brighter yellow in some cases. And then Penstemon small eye is one of those that are not native to Virginia, native slightly south of Virginia. I love it. It's a beard tongue. We do have a native beard tongue that's white, but this is a great plant if you're open to including those plants that are not in the Virginia flora. Go to the next slide. And then in summer, we've got the ubiquitous Echinacea purpurea, which, as I mentioned before, I primarily grow, not just because it is a great, easy growing plant easy plant to grow, but I love the medicinal value that it offers. And we've got the bee balm, the fistulous version of the Menorrhea, which is a huge bee attracting. Next. And then in the summer, we get the swamp milkweed, which attracts the monarch butterflies, and the Anacysta agastache funiculum, which is again another technically not native to this area. The agastaches that are native to this area are not very available at nurseries. And that's true of the Echinacea too. There is an Echinacea native to this area, but it's just very hard to source around here from our native plant nurseries. And this is a widely available perennial that is native to other regions outside of Virginia, does beautifully. Next slide. Also has medicinal value. Now in the summer, we have some of these neutral, the mountain mint, which you talked about, fabulous. And one of my favorites, which is actually an annual, which is spotted bee balm, Menorrhea punctata, kind of makes you think about Alice in Wonderland. It's a little it's crazy, whimsical looking, and bees love it. But these aren't they're kind of neutral color, other than the blooms have some different color. The bees obviously see something here attracts them that we can't. It's probably part of their eye prism that they're seeing things that we can't in these, and they just go wild. Next slide. So here's a few combinations from summer. We got the Penstemon small eye and the butterfly weed. That's a kind of, that's not a complementary, but that's you're getting into that, experimenting with other parts of the color wheel. Next slide. This is Coreopsis mixed with Lysimachia lanceolata, which is more of a grassy, also has, these are the blue flowers, but you've got the textures. What you have is sort of purplish grass with the verticillata, which is more kind of, almost like, thread leafy. And so combining textures in summer is also a really great thing to do. Next slide. And then we have purple coneflower with something that's often considered a weed, which is fleabane, but it actually creates an incredible combination if you do it kind of neatly. Next slide. And then mountain mint, also with echinacea, they go beautifully together. The contrast of the purple with the neutral. Next slide. And this is a common bone set, can go with anything because it's neutral, it's white, but all these other colors in the background. Next slide. And then another one of my favorites is to mix the Agastoche funiculum with smooth oxide. You again, you're moving back to that complementary yellow and blue. Next slide. Okay, late summer and fall, things really begin to get pretty vibrant. Black-eyed Susan, the baby Joe Pye weed. Next slide. And the cardinal flower, bright red. Blue mist flower, pretty robust, but I do love it. Next slide. And then the white wood aster and the blue wood aster. Next slide. And then late summer and fall, again, you're getting back to this blue and yellow. You've got the asters, you got giant blue lobelia, you've got New York ironweed, and then this combination, you've got goldenrod, you've got black-eyed Susan going in there. So again, we're back to that late summer, fall. The bees are beginning to get really kind of frenzied to collect that pollen and nectar before the year's up. So those are the colors of summer and fall, late summer and fall. Next slide. And then of course, in the fall, we have the grasses, and the grasses come into play. They begin to really show themselves. Here are a few of my favorites. The northern river oats, I'd be careful with that. I have a riparian buffer that I plant them in, and so I grow it for that. But it can be pretty aggressive. Next slide. So here's just a few examples of just kind of combining the seasonality. So this is early fall. This is basically a naturalized mix of native perennials, a lot of grasses, ground covers in here with pops of color throughout. And right now what you're seeing are the black-eyed Susans. Next slide. Another kind of mix. I love combining black-eyed Susan, asters, and goldenrod in the fall. Next slide. Now, don't forget about shrubs. You can always use shrubs to get that color mix and that seasonality. Here's a combination on the bottom. You've got yellow, that's Plethora alnifolia, always yellow like that in the fall. I love to plant it in groupings. Oak leaf hydrangea, also not native to this area, but a wonderful shrub, native shrub, which turns purple or various browns. And then the American Beauty Berry on top with its purple lime colored leaves and purple berries. It's all growing together on my property and just this incredible fall display. Next slide. So this is just a naturalistic garden that's fading out in the fall, but you can see how the cardinal flower really pops. Next slide. And then the Joe Pye weed, just kind of blending in with everything else. Not super vibrant, but it's just a huge butterfly and bee attractor. Go ahead, next. And then here, just a mix of this fall, grasses and perennials. You see the goldenrod blooming in the back, but everything else is beginning to fade, but it's all kind of melding together. Next slide.
We have one question in the chat, if you don't mind taking.
I'm almost done.
Okay.
So let's just finish it up. This is more grasses. Next slide. This is fall again. Now in the fall, like with the shrubs, I mean, things go incredibly colorful if you know what you're doing it. This is Amsonia hubrici, which is not native to this area, native to technically Arkansas, further south. Unbelievably beautiful native plant, though, not native to Virginia, but it does gorgeous, and the fall color is just to die for. In front of it is Father Yellow Gardeni, a wonderful shrub, also not native to this area, but native to North Carolina, Tennessee. Next. So, quick recap. When you're combining native plants, you want to work with the colors of nature. You want to combine structures and texture. You want to plant in layers to find those companions. You want to practice successional planting. And important to remember, there's no wrong combination of native plants unless they're not suitable to the site. Other than assuming they're all suitable to the site, there's no wrong combination. One thing to do, you can always practice with containers. So I have a few containers here. It's like, I'm not sure what it's going to look like to have this plant with that plant or this grass with that plant. Try to get a container first. See how you like the way it looks and the way it acts. And then just basically experiment and have fun. I think this is the last slide coming up now. This is Max photobombing my attempt to take pictures of spring flowers. And that's it for me. Thank you so much for listening. Now,
Folks, we do have about 5 minutes for Q and A. I'll lead off with one from the chat, if that's okay. So, Mary Banger asks, once a garden is established, is there much maintenance to do? Thinning and moving young plants in particular?
Yes, I prefer to call it design editing. With native plants, yes, so some of them have a mind of their own. One of them is the cardinal flower. You'll plant it in one place and it pops up somewhere else the next year. So, absolutely. And the best native gardeners are gardeners. They're people who love to garden and will do that kind of what I call design editing, which could be pruning, light pruning, moving, et cetera. So, yeah.
Great, okay, thank you.
Is there any site that you can think of that you've not been able to find a native solution for?
No. There's some solution for every problem. Yeah,
What's the secret to getting native plants?
you need to find it?
Finding them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we have the wonderful native plant nurseries in this area. Further, I'm thinking probably more Fairfax, but we've got, Ursanga, and we have Nature by Design. And, it's important to support those. There's also Watermark Woods, which is up in Leesburg, probably farther away. And there's probably more down here. And for my business, because when I'm buying plants for a site and an installation, I'm usually, the quantities I'm buying are larger than what they can provide. And so I deal with wholesale providers. If you're willing to go a little bit further, some of these have retail sales as well. And they offer a lot more variety.
I was just gonna say, in a lot of those that only do wholesale will be in the native plant sales.
Absolutely. Thank you for mentioning that. Yes, they're all coming up. Yeah, yes.
On the matrix, I think it was the matrix planting that you did where you do the, what did you call them, the wholesale pots?
Landscape
The
plugs.
The plugs, you plant them densely. It looked great after a year. That was instant gratification. How does it look in 5 years? Are you
Mhm.
thinning out?
Still
at that
pretty
point?
good. Some of them you might be thinning out. It could be kind of optional. You want to create that dense. You want them growing right up against each other.
Right.
And so, it's what I call garden editing. In any case, you can't just plant it and leave it alone. You've got to go and see, is something running amok? Is something, does something need to be cut back?
Right, that's where I call that high maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
I have Joe Highweed in my yard. I planted it 10 years ago. Now it's falling all over everything. I don't even know how to handle that. It's so big now, I can't even dig it up.
Right.
Just to chop.
And that's where you're gonna want to be thinning it out and maybe seeing how big it is in the spring and maybe just kind of, cutting away, dividing and replanting. But yes, the Chelsea chop is critical for some of the larger plants. And if
I
you
find the
don't,
same thing true for the sweet spire. It's out of control in my front yard. I planted one.
yeah.
Back before I realized what native plants were all about, I said, okay, I'm gonna go native.
Mhm.
I went through that phase and I planted a sweet spire and now I have a huge amount.
Yeah, then it's time to get out and
Get it.
It's time to get out the clippers or the pruners.
So there's
Yes.
also some great like social media groups for native plant swaps, and some people will come to you and dig it out and say it's available, then you don't even have to be the one to dig it.
I just
thought
that.
Fire or something, and they'll come to you and take it.
Yes.
Do you use mulch at all, or are you using the ground cover as mulch?
So initially, when you're planting the ground cover, they're like gonna be at least 12 inches apart. So I apply, when we do in garden installations, we use leaf mulch. And we definitely initially apply a pretty thick layer of leaf mulch, which decomposes pretty, readily, much more so than hardwood mulch. And then eventually the idea is that it should be optional, because the ground covers they're gonna meet, they're gonna connect.
So in the winter, it sounds like the only thing that's green is maybe the carrots.
And the Pacra aurea, there are some, the carrot, and there are some native perennials that stay green in the winter. Blue-eyed grass, my experience is it stays pretty green.
Labra,
The Pacra is definitely evergreen.
the hollies, labra.
Right, your shrubs, there are several shrubs that are evergreen. So, you know, you want, if you, that's important to you, you look at that in your plant selection, what's considered evergreen. Any other questions?
When you're cutting back, so you leave your flower skeletons up over the winter, when, do you have to cut those back for all perennials, or is that something?
Well, that's kind of that would be like a maintenance question. You don't have to, but if you, they will eventually fall over.
Oh.
If you leave them standing, when the new plants come up, you know, they're gonna basically fall over. So it's just kind of how neat do you want the garden to look? And when you do it, you know, the ecologist might say, well, wait until the temperature is 50 degrees before you cut them down, because there might be, you know, insects burrowing in them and nesting in them. That's kind of late, honestly, for a lot of people to wait and, but you know, if you're really, that's certainly the preferred thing. But I see people cutting down, their perennials earlier than that, if they want to, you know, March, because the other thing is if you wait too long to cut things down and clean up for spring, you do your spring cleanup. If you want mulch, that's when you're gonna put it down. But if you wait too long, the perennials are already coming up and it's really hard to disentangle all of this. So it's, you know, it's a matter of personal preference. Okay, thank you all so much. It's been great.